No one admires courage more than I do, but I always regret to hear the hero trumpeting his own fame. All right, so that is a quote by Major Robert Anderson, and that is going to be the guy basically in charge here of our continuing story here at Fort Sumter, which is basically the first takeoff of the Civil War, the American Civil War. Okay, so we left off where we're talking about the town of Charleston. The pretty crazy things that were going on, in Charleston, just kind of in the town there. So check that out in the previous episode here. But basically, tensions are getting pretty high. Lincoln is, he's elected. This is, November. Lincoln is elected. Abraham Lincoln is elected. The South is kind of going nuts. They don't know, what's going to happen to their way of life and all this and all that. So yeah, tensions are pretty high. We're at Fort Sumter, which is a little fort basically on a little island off the coast, of Charleston, South Carolina. And Major Robert Anderson, who we're going to learn about now, is in charge of the whole deal. All right. So he's put into quite, if you can imagine being him, this is why I like this story. If you can imagine being Major Robert Anderson at the first battle of the, not first battle, but, it's hard to even define it as a battle. But if you can imagine being in his position where you have, this group of people in Charleston that are about to start firing or doing something crazy on this army fort that you're in charge of. Remember, the war hasn't started yet. So, we might be talking a little differently if this is down the line and you're just, the war's kicking off, everything's going, you kind of know what the deal is. But nothing's happened yet, okay? So he's in the middle of this position, just this guy who he does a lot in his career. He's a good, just kind of humble guy who, he's not out for fame, but he does a good job in everything that he does. Okay. He wasn't really a big fan of war. All right. Major Robert Anderson. He's not a big war hound. Okay. He's not a war hawk. He doesn't really, he's seen a lot of war. Okay. Which, it's a common theme that you'll run into when you study these, generals and big officers from back in the time, or really any time. You see war and then you kind of start asking, what are we doing this for? You know what I mean? So, and that was kind of a lot of what Major Anderson would said. One quote from him, it even describes him as loathing war. He says, "I think that killing people is a very poor way of settling national grievances. I think that killing people is a very poor way of settling national grievances." Okay. So, right. He's seen war. He's seen some crazy stuff. He's, so he went to West Point, as many of these guys did. All right. So about 1852, he gets his first experience with war, where he starts forming these opinions that war is, you know what they say, war is hell. You know what I mean? So we got a Native American, we got an Indian called Black Hawk. Okay. And there's kind of a little dust up going on up with Black Hawk and some raids, some pretty crazy stuff. I'm not really that all too familiar with that little tiffle there, but I do know that Major Anderson got his first that Rob Anderson got his first little taste up there. So he leads a group of volunteers, basically some militiamen from Illinois, to go after Black Hawk. And Black Hawk is this guy that, like I said, he's leading some raids. on, they had their, you could say that they had their differences back then, the Native Americans of various tribes. So Anderson takes out this group of militiamen from these volunteers from Illinois who was on the volunteer team. It's a small world out here. Little old Abraham Lincoln himself. Okay. He goes out with them. I'm not sure how old. Well, let's see. That was 18. I said 52. This is 1825. Okay. So Abe Lincoln had to be, gosh, he couldn't have been old. I don't know. I'd have to see, but 1825. So however old Lincoln was in 1825, he was out there with Anderson, and then years later, look at him. So, it's crazy, and a lot of these names are going to come out, are going to come up again with how it seems like all these guys knew each other, So we've got, here we go, Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, right? Where he's serving right alongside Anderson in that Black Hawk little dust up. Okay, so Anderson's going through some of these Seminole Wars. He's going through the war in Mexico. Okay, did a lot in the war in Mexico. He became really close with General Winfield Scott. Okay, that's a name you're going to hear quite a few times in the American Civil War. He's working at his staff. He's real good friends with Winfield Scott. Okay, they become really close with each other, and later on we're going to hear some more about that. He's talking about. Okay, so now, this goes back. It's going to reference a few times here his kind of distaste for war and just kind of, and like I said, he did his job. But he really, I think, wished there was a different way of going about things. Right here it says, it really goes to my heart to be compelled to do my duty when I know that every shot either injures or seriously distresses the poor, inoffensive women and children who have neither part nor lot in this war. So he's saying, it makes it really hard job to do when you know that there's a stray musket ball going into, right in the middle of someone's dinner table with just a lady and some child trying to, just live life like normal, right? So, and that's during this, the Mexican Wars and all that stuff. He's, and listen, he's not a softie, okay? He's a badass dude. Right here, we're talking Battle of Molino del Rey. So basically, him and his guys go in, they have to capture there's basically an angle, right? There's this town and they got to get the one building that has the angle. If they can take that building, they have superiority of that terrain. And, they're good. They can move and do their siege, whatever. During this little battle, he's leading his guys. He gets wounded in 5 places. Okay. Wounded in 5 places, keeps trucking along, doesn't even faze him. He's being carried out on a stretcher. He's still, you grab that, he's still leading his guys until basically, he just passes out. So, like I said, he's no softie. He's a cool dude. He's a badass dude. All right. Let's not get that wrong. Just because he doesn't, he has opinions on, that there's probably some better ways to settle things besides war. He's probably not so wrong about that. He's 5'9". He's a little short guy. I mean, I know. No offense if you're 5'9". You know what I'm saying. So yeah, he's going into West Point, and now, so West Point, he does a lot in West Point. Okay, he's like basically the artillery king. He's the go-to guy about artillery. Okay, Rob Anderson. He's he ends up coming up with basically the manual that the Army is going to use for artillery. Okay, pretty cool. And some more names are going to come up with that. I'm going to flip to my notes here, because right here we're going to get into this part that I find really interesting, and that's so there's a theme. You know, if you guys are familiar, when the war ends and they're signing the papers, you know, you got Grant and Jefferson Davis, and they're signing the paper ending the war. They sign it, they walk out the house, and Grant's guys start cheering and hooping and hollering. And Grant tells them, hey, guys, let's lock it up. You know what I'm saying? Let's lock it up. Let's chill it out. We got to rebuild as a country now. The whole point of this war is to not for one side to win. Well, at least from the North's perspective, the whole point of the war is we want to be a country again. We want to be one country again. We don't want to be divided. We don't want to end up divided. So how are we going to, you know, if we're going to fight this whole war and say that's what we're about, and then, you know, basically spike the ball at the end, you know what I mean? Let's lead by example. You know what I'm saying? So that you know, that's at the end of the war. Now to the beginning, where Rob Anderson's kind of got the same kind of ideas. All right, he's a pretty chill guy. Okay, he's described as even discreet. Okay, so he keeps to himself, but again, this guy does a good job. There's, you know, at least in this account, not a whole lot of complaints about Rob. So that brings that quote I started off this cast here with. No one admires courage more than I do, but I always regret to hear the hero trumpeting his own fame. Okay. Now I'm going to hit this other little quote that he said, and then we're going to talk about it for a second. So he's talking about, we're going to go to a time when he's captured some soldiers during the Mexican War, and he wouldn't even like to. He'd be wary of walking by them and making eye contact, because, as he said, I was afraid they might detect something of triumph in my countenance when I thought them so humiliated by their surrender. So we're really not saying, you know, like I said, he's not a softie. He's not saying you can't celebrate. He's not saying it's not that it's wrong to I guess, well, like I say, spike the ball. But what he's saying is, when you're doing it at the expense or humiliation of someone else, and that's kind of the difference. Okay. You know, it's okay to have pride, but it's just a respect for these other humans that they're fighting against, right? As he's described, he kind of understands that war has become this thing where you're kind of just in it, and when you're in it, you know, you're not really thinking about, you know, as a member of the military, you know, a soldier on the ground, you're not thinking about the cause of the war, the politics, when whoever got elected. Okay, you're really just probably thinking about keeping yourself alive, and you're thinking about the guy next to you, right? It's kind of how the whole deal works, right? And then, you know, that's kind of what keeps guys going. You don't necessarily have a whole force of people that, as they're loading their musket shot after shot, they're thinking about how great it's going to be when the country is won again. I'm not saying they don't, but I'm saying in the moment, they're thinking about keeping their buddies alive, right? They're thinking about keeping themselves alive. So he recognizes this and recognizes that even his enemies are probably in the same kind of boat, right? They've got families, they're men, they're humans. You know, unfortunately, he has to capture them. Rob Anderson has to capture some of these Mexican soldiers. But he's so sensitive to them detecting that he, I think, enjoys this. He's like, look, you guys, It is what it is, right? You got captured. I got to capture you. You know, it's the name of the game. For whatever reason, I got to capture you. But, you know, I respect why you're here. I respect why I'm here. And, you know, I'm not enjoying this. All right. So, oh boy. So that kind of gives you, that's kind of the guy Rob Anderson is. All right. I admire the guy. So, you know, from what I know of him, from some of the few accounts, he's definitely a guy to be admired as far as figures in the Civil War. Okay. So now let's go on. We're going to talk about Rob gets himself hitched. All right. He gets married. He gets married to a woman named Eliza Bayard Clinch. Okay. Now this is an interesting thing. So she is sick all the time. I don't know how else to put it. His wife has some sort of thing that just makes her sick all the time. There seems to be some medical speculation as what it is, but nothing really, you know, I would say of exactly what was going on with her. But she's sick a lot. He even goes as far as to tell her, you know, not to write, you know, like, hey, don't worry. You can shorten these letters up. You know, they're writing letters back and forth back in. You can shorten these letters up because I know you're sick. So, you know, don't, you know, spend all the energy writing letters to me. Save yourself, you know, in your bed, laying down there. So he's a nice guy, right? Rob Anderson is a nice guy. And as him and his wife get married, okay, so here's an interesting thing. Okay, so now let's talk about Rob Anderson and let's talk about slavery, because you know, I feel like there's a curiosity whenever you discuss anybody, you know, any figure in this war. How'd they feel about slavery, right? That's kind of what this whole deal ends up, you know, at the end of the day, kind of being about. You know what I mean? So there, generally, he wasn't too much of an opinionated guy on slavery. Okay, so here's one thing we do know though: him and his wife inherited slaves. Okay. So Rob Anderson and his wife, Eba Clinch, they inherited slaves. She came from a family with some decent money. And so now get this. Now we can kind of make up our own minds about how Rob feels about slavery. So Rob Anderson and his wife inherit slaves. They sell the slaves to a guy, right? As soon as they get them, they get them. They're not utilizing slaves, okay? So they sell them to this guy, right? On an IOU. They say, here, we inherited the slaves. You know, we'll sell them to you for however much. Just we'll make a note of it and you can pay us back, you know, whenever. Who knows what their deal was. So this was before any of the Fort Sumter stuff went down, right? So again, him and his wife inherit some slaves. They sell the slaves to a guy basically on an IOU, and they tell the guy, just pay us back whenever you can. So then Fort Sumter goes down, and the guy who they sold the slaves to, who still owed them for the slaves, he said he refused to pay Robert Anderson for the slaves because of his involvement at Fort Sumter, because of his actions at Fort Sumter. Okay. So this guy, you know, this guy who had slaves and bought slaves from Rob Anderson said, I'm not going to pay you for these because I didn't, you know, like what you were about there at Fort Sumter. Okay. And, you know, Rob Anderson is kind of representing more the North, you know, abolitionist side of the, I don't even know if it's quite fair to say abolitionist, but He's not joining with the Confederacy, right, in the fight for, among other things, slavery. Rob Anderson is fighting for the Union. And this guy decides, I'm not going to pay you what the money I owe you because, you're fighting for the Union, basically. And I saw what you did there at Fort Sumter. So, you know what I'm saying? How did Rob Anderson feel about slaves? I don't know. With how he seemed to be a pretty introspective person. He seemed to be a very humble person and empathetic person. So my take gathering from reading all this, in this chapter, specifically just about Robert Anderson and his background, was that he'd probably, I don't even want to say, I don't want to speculate too much here, but I would say he's, well, here, how about this? He was fighting on the Union side at Fort Sumter. All right, so let's just maybe leave it at that. All right. So, his wife and Eba, he's a loyal guy to his sick little wife, Eba. They meet through Winfield Scott, remember? Robert Anderson and Winfield Scott, good buddies. Okay, good buddies. Okay, now moving down the line in Rob Anderson's career here. He's a guy he's not looking for desk jobs either. Okay, he's looking for jobs that'll put him out fighting. He's not a guy that likes to step up in front of the line for promotion, right? He kind of just hangs back and he likes to hang with the with the guys, right? He likes to be out there fighting, and that's just kind of the guy he is, right? I think we've kind of got a good idea of who he is at the time. Late in his military career, he gets thrown on kind of a admin duty that Winfield Scott gave him, and probably to kind of hook him up because he was getting old, and he said, here, man, I'll give you this duty. You don't really have to hardly do anything. All right. If you were in the military, you know what I'm talking about. So he got put on one of those duties that was just kind of like, hey, look, spend a couple of years out here supervising these, whatever it was, it was like supervising the production of steel or something, right? Just chill here, Rob. You've done a good job. I got you a sweet little duty station. You can relax and kind of finish out your career. Well, during that, his little chill thing, which he wasn't so stoked about. He wasn't so excited about. Well, things are starting to get pretty sticky, pretty hairy in Charleston, right? So then comes orders for Major Robert Anderson, 1st Artillery, will forthwith proceed to Fort Moultrie and immediately relieve Colonel John Gardner, Lieutenant Colonel of 1st Artillery, in command thereof, by command of Lieutenant General Winfield Scott. All right. So he gets his orders to go over to Fort Moultrie, which is, in the bay and, across the bay from Fort Sumter. Basically to Charleston. Okay. Also, now we're going to close out here. We're going to go back to talking about kind of his disposition on slavery, on secession. It does say he indicated a vague sympathy for the South and the concern of its white leaders about the status of slavery. So, like I said, I think the guy was just empathetic. And I think he wasn't afraid to look at things from both sides and say, yeah, I see why they are upset, from, if you can isolate this whole thing down, I could see why these slave owners are upset. I understand what the problem is. As far as secession, though, Robert Anderson is opposed to secession. Though, again, he's kind of a man of, he's not He's more of a lover than a fight. He's a lover that has done a lot of fighting. Okay. He really doesn't want to see a war over this thing. You got Robert Anderson here, who basically really is not about war. He's not a war guy. He's seen too much of it to know that, what are we doing? War is not the way to solve anything. And now here he is. He's going to be in charge of the beginning of the American Civil War. Okay? Crazy. Right? Crazy. So, that's where we leave off there. And you guys, we'll see you in the next episode.